All right. And we've got nobody on the phone today.
Okay.
Oh, it's okay. All right, next we're gonna move on to meeting minutes. Folks had a chance to look those over. And in that,
To approve the meeting minutes.
all right. Do we have a second? Second. Okay, any discussion on the minutes? All right, all in favor of approving the meeting minutes and accepting the audio as the official meeting record?
Aye.
Any nays? All right, that motion passes. All right, moving on to public communications. Yes. We did not do the agenda. Oh, we forgot the agenda.
You also didn't introduce what the commission did. Did you do the introduction?
I did the,
Okay.
that. Okay, so let's, first, let's go back into our agenda. So, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Move approval.
All right, any discussion on the agenda?
Commissioner Messenger isn't here tonight. Did you want to wait for him to do the rules of procedure? I mean, if you feel comfortable taking it.
I think we could probably take it.
Okay, cool.
So he didn't ask for us not to.
Perfect.
I talked.
Thanks.
All right, and with that, all in favor, or is there any discussion on the agenda? Okay, all in favor of approving the agenda?
Aye.
Any nays? All right, now we're back on track. Okay, moving on to public communications. So for those participating via Zoom, please raise your hand. And to address the planning commission, you'll be promoted to a panelist. And then when it's your turn to speak, you will have 3 minutes. Is there anybody? Okay, we've got 2 hands. And do we have any, would you like to make comment too? So we'll go to the boardroom next. So, but we'll start on the phone. Sure.
Call her by name.
Okay, we're working on getting you promoted, Phyllis, and then you'll get 3 minutes once we get started. All right. Go
Can
ahead.
you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, good. Good evening, Commissioners. Phyllis Farrell. I live in unincorporated Thurston County. Thanks for your hard work and service here. I would like to speak to you tonight regarding our planning for future growth in housing. According to our Thurston County survey, residents value the rural character of Thurston County and they want it preserved. Those of us concerned about climate and environmental protections for endangered species, habitat, water quality, and water availability, we want the rural areas of the counties to remain rural. A goal of the Growth Management Act is to protect agriculture lands and activities. And as you know, our agriculture lands in Thurston County are threatened. The Sustainable Thurston Report recommended a 5% allocation for growth in rural housing in order to protect agriculture and forest lands. There are issues associated with water availability, the lack of utilities, and the increased transportation impacting emissions and infrastructure are factors which should limit rural growth. Current housing allocation proposals of 14% for rural areas are not reconcilable with the Sustainable Thurston recommendations, would jeopardize forest and agriculture lands and our climate goals in our TCMP. I am aware of the need for affordable housing in the rural areas, especially for farm workers and family farm relatives. However, limiting rural housing growth to 5%, if judiciously planned, should come close to addressing those needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. All right, next we'll go to Loretta Sepinen.
Hello, this is Loretta Sepinen. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I want to speak about two aspects of the data that you will not see tonight. That's about housing that I think is important for you to have to consider housing policies for the UGA and for the unincorporated rural areas, and to keep in mind the new requirements, legal requirements too, for the comp plan. My first point is the same point that I made at the last Planning Commission meeting, and that is that we need data separately for the UGA and for the rural areas. We do not really need to have data like the demographic data for the county as a whole. That's not going to help us make the policy decisions we make. One of the basic kind of data that we could get that's by UGA and the rural area is the 2023 estimates that the Thurston Regional Planning Council has done about the percentage of units of housing in 2023 by area. And those percentages are 53% is in the cities, 30% is in the rural area, and 17% is in the UGA. And I think that's important when we're doing the comp plan to figure out what our vision for the future is for what we want those percentages to be. That's a key question in our planning. We also need to learn about family income level. That's a new requirement in the for the comprehensive plan. And the Department of Commerce has provided our staff with the 2020 census data on housing units by the percent of family income by jurisdiction. And when I looked at these data, I found that the mix of household incomes that was in the UGA versus what's in the rural area were significantly different. The difference is higher incomes people, 100% of AMI or above, were 2 times more likely to be in the rural area than in the UGA. And the inverse was true for the people in the family income that is between 50% and 100% of AMI. They're 2 times more likely to be in the UGA than they are to be in the rural area. I think these make a difference for our land use planning and for our housing concepts into the future. So I'd love to see the staff, and I will be reaching out to the staff to help bring that information into the conversation as we move into the housing chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. All right, anybody else online who would like to make comment? All right, Mr. Crawford, you're up. Go ahead and,
Stand here.
I think the microphones are closer to the podium. Then go ahead and state your name and where you live for the record.
There's no microphone here.
Oh, it hides in the ceiling.
My name is Tom Crawford. I live in the unincorporated areas of Thurston County. And I'm also a board member of Thurston Climate Action Team. And I'd just like to make a general, I think fairly simple statement in terms of my personal interest in as you'll be talking about the climate element, particularly tonight. I'm especially interested in promoting whatever is necessary within the comprehensive plan to ensure that we as a county and as a set of communities meet the goals that are stated, the numeric goals that are stated for reducing greenhouse gas emissions those goals are stated in the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, which the county has signed off on. And so, and my organization, I know will also be looking pretty hard at, does the comprehensive plan help us do the things that are necessary to reach those goals?
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. All right, anyone else who'd like to make public comment? Anybody online or in the boardroom? Good, all right.
I have one. I mean, it's not necessarily germane to business. I figured this is the right spot for it.
Probably good of the order. You want to do it good of the order?
That sounds great.
Okay. I mean, we could now, but. All right, next, we're gonna move on to new business. We're gonna move on to the adoption of the planning commission's rules and procedures. It's governing documents. So those should have come out to everybody. Folks had a chance to look through those. Would we be ready to move to adopt those tonight?
The only question I have is, and this is just a type of thing, under definitions, I think, it says staff means community planning staff, chair means planning commission chair, that line goes underneath staff as the definition, I don't know. Just me in my mind thinking about.
Somebody needs to hit return.
Yeah. Okay. Just a minor, that, just. That's the only problem I saw with it. That's not a problem. That's
And
just a typo.
yeah, I figure that's not even a typo, it's a formatting issue.
Well, I would move to adopt the rules of procedure for the Thurston County Planning Commission dated April 2024.
I'll second that.
All right, we have that moved and seconded. Any discussion?
Yeah, I got a few. On page 3B. The chair shall have full power to create a subcommittee of one or more members. I think the subcommittee needs to be at least 2 members.
I'd be interested in hearing the argument for having a subcommittee of one member. I think there is one, but I think it needs to be stated by whoever wrote that wonderful bit of policy.
I don't remember if that was an original, from the original construction.
Was that in the 2013?
I'd have to look really quick. If there are other items, I'll look and we can come back to it.
Okay, so I guess the next one is right below that in meeting records. The report of the demographic makeup of the commission. And I don't think that's necessary, mostly because we have no control over that. That's 100% up to the county commissioners.
Your statement.
I think it's true that we don't have access to, we don't have the power to change that directly, but we don't have the power to change anything directly. Everything that we do is by recommendation. And if we are noticing the obvious reality of the demographic makeup of this particular room, I think it's worth noting that so that there's a metric by which we can judge, by which commissioners can judge their future commissions.
You have to do is look at a planning commission meeting.
Right.
Just a clarification, the chair shall have full power to create subcommittees of one or more members is something that has been in there. It used to live under section 4. It's now under section 5, but it is unchanged.
The commissioner's point about once per year providing an automated report for commission of the demographic makeup. I personally don't have any concerns with this. To me, it looks like a data reporting. And if we're reporting the facts, I don't see what the harm could be in that for the residents of the county.
I would just add that if we're reporting demographic data, not all demographic data is necessarily apparent by looking at someone, so.
Yes, which is why that the optional self-identification is so key. We're not like investigating and outing people.
People can report if they want to, so I don't really see an issue.
I would, on the original point about a single member to a subcommittee, I would still support that if for no other reasons. A lot of times there are minor investigations that don't really need multiple people, but by having the subcommittee, it then gives access to a staffer. So if I am a sole member of a subcommittee, but I want to talk to Andrew about something very specific to that subcommittee, I can then call him and he can spend the resource on me as a planning commissioner instead of as a member of the public.
I think we can all do that anyways. I mean, if I have a question for somebody, I think I can, for a staff member, I think I can call them.
I think so, but I think this formalizes it. You know, it would make it so that way if for some reason, well, we've had contentions before between planning commission and staff, and thankfully we don't have any of those now. But I would hate for me to call a staffer and say, you don't have a subcommittee, I can't spend resources on you on that topic.
Say you, Miss O'Reilly.
I mean, I think it is nice to have the direction of the planning commission to like identify where that additional work might be directed versus just a phone call from an individual planning commissioner whim, because usually the subcommittees are discussed amongst all of you before the chair, you know, says to create one. So it's basically assigning staff resources at the will of the entire planning commission.
But I also don't have strong feelings on it, so if it's something that gets at your craw, I'm not gonna go to bat any harder than I have.
Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of the point is it goes to the staff resources point. Do we want to, how much staff resource do we want to spend on one person's opinion versus what we, you know, what we already do in here? Because I mean, I think if somebody asks a question of staff in our meetings, they're gonna go look into it anyways.
As
So
long as
what if,
consensus is that they should do that, yeah. That's how we've done it in the past.
and I just think that I don't know what we gain from a subcommittee of one person. Because it's just one person coming to us with their thoughts and findings. There's nobody else bouncing ideas off of them. It's.
So this has been the rule for what, at least a decade now? I'm curious, has there been an issue with a person forming a subcommittee of one? I think if I understand the process correctly, it's generally the chair in a meeting as part of a discussion is setting up a subcommittee. So there's time for feedback on selection, and I'm sure the chair would take into consideration if there was a contingent of the committee that was opposed to forming a committee of one. And the discussion is not necessarily in the subcommittee. The subcommittee works and reports to the full committee. That's where the bounce back happens. I haven't personally heard an articulated reason as to why we shouldn't have a committee of one, I guess.
I don't wanna peel scabs here or anything like that, because all the people that were involved in prior times are gone. But there has been a time where, as a planning commissioner, I reached out to staff on an issue and was not able to have the conversations that I wanted to. But if I was there on official subcommittee business empowered by the planning commissioner, I think that would have changed that conversation and my access to that particular staff.
I can confirm that.
The one I guess the biggest argument I could see for making it a subcommittee, a minimum of 2 people, that's like that sort of combined are accountability. If we are sending someone off on a homework mission, it helps to have someone else that's also on that. I know that's very true for myself. Daniel can attest. But I also think that it implies a certain amount of buy-in from the commission overall. If we're just kind of, I think the argument that I can see, something I think Scott's saying a little bit here is that it limits our capacity to just generate subcommittees. Like everyone being a subcommittee of one person, who's off doing any number of tasks. We have to have a couple people who are willing to commit themselves to something, and I think that's valuable. So that that also gives strength to, if someone won't see you on an issue, there's someone else who's part of that conversation who can have your back on it. And I think that's useful.
All right, so how do we want to do some of this? Do we want to vote through some of these changes?
I think somebody could move to strike and if we could vote on it that way.
Or move to amend.
Friendly amendment.
I think that's what Scott's asking for.
Yeah, like I'm kind of with Eric. It's not a huge issue for me. I just think it's strange to me to have a subcommittee where one person goes out and does their research, and
Well, as the planning
Which
commission.
I do every meeting.
Yeah, but as you were the planning commission chair for like three years in a row, weren't you? Did you ever see a one-person committee?
No, but we have until this rule subcommittee. We haven't even had a subcommittee in more than 10 years. I think.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, use of subcommittee has been pretty limited.
and that's another thing where, I mean, my whole issue with subcommittees is we're supposed to be a public group and we're supposed to have public meetings. And anytime you get people meeting on their own, it always brings in that, because I know that's what happened. That's part of the reason I first got on the planning commission was I was going to meetings, planning commission meetings, sitting in that audience every other week. And I'd come to a meeting and find out that there was a subcommittee meeting in between the last 2 meetings. And they had discussions about something that maybe I was interested in. And it was like, well, it's a subcommittee. We don't have to tell you.
Yeah.
So.
And that happened to me with the SMP, if you recall.
We didn't have subcommittees.
No, they had meetings with what they called,
Oh, they're technical advisory groups.
yes,
Yeah.
which really kind of peeved me off, which is one of the reasons I wanted to join the planning commission.
So we have a strong impulse for transparency.
Right, Barry, I was on the SAG.
I know you were.
So anyway, I guess at this point, I would say we can, in my opinion, I think we can leave it. But I think for me to not argue against it, somebody's gonna have to make a really good reason why they should be a subcommittee of one.
Imagine a scenario where we have some person on our commission who has maybe extraordinary personal experience on a topic. And we might ask that person to spend some time and empower them as a subcommittee so they can have good access to staff. But no decision's gonna be made. They're just gonna come back and, as Commissioner Baumgartner said, they will be presenting it and there will be a vigorous discussion. There won't be any decisions made in secret or anything like that. There'll be a wide open opportunity for conversation. So I would favor just leaving it as it is. Just because it's functioned very well for the last 10 years or so, I guess. It doesn't guarantee transparency. That whether it's 5 people on a subcommittee or one person, we have to have that big conversation one way or another, so.
it seems to me to be a good insurance policy in the event that we did need a subcommittee of one.
Yeah.
If we turn up the contrast one way where there's absolutely nobody else available to do this task and Commissioner Day is, for example, then it makes sense to have it in that instance. If we turn it up the other way where everybody's a subcommittee of one, obviously there's some ridiculousness in that, and not very likely scenario. So it seems like it'd be best to leave it as opposed to strike it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that like, I think that it's a really important point to bring up in terms of our vision, in terms of, reinforcing our commitment to transparency, but I would move that we continue on with this. Beyond there, I thank Commissioner Nelson for bringing it up, because I think that actually is a conversation we needed to have about how we do subcommittees in practice.
All right.
So the last one I have is on page 5, the appearance of fairness doctrine. And I think that needs to, I just think we need to add something about quasi judicial decisions. Because that's what the appearance of fairness doctrine applies to.
Could you point out which section?
Page 5 at the very top. So it's part of conflict of interest. And then I'll just add that this goes back to another bone I have to pick. Because technically, the Thurston County Planning Commission is not covered by the appearance for fairness doctrine anymore, because the county has decided that we don't make quasi judicial decisions.
Could you repeat that, please?
The county has decided that we are not covered under appearance of fairness, because the county has decided that we do not make quasi judicial decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even
He's right.
even though, you know, the theory, I mean, my opinion of it is, if we're discussing, let's say, one of these industrial lands applications, we are making a specific decision on a specific property. And I think it's fair to ask us to disclose if we have conflict. But the county has said that's not quasi judicial, that's comp plan. So we aren't covered, we don't have to do it. And the county commissioners did this back in maybe 2016, whenever the Port of Tacoma thing came up. So, and there was a county commissioner that had a clear conflict of interest. So I mean, I think it should be in there, but I think it needs to state that, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, that the appearance of fairness doctrine applies to quasi judicial, not comp plan decisions.
It does seem to me that this is just a resource. It's a resource. And I wonder if the resource talked about that distinction.
It does go, I'm looking at it right now. It goes into quasi-judicial actions and distinction between those and legislative or policy-making decisions. And it does say that, you know, it applies to a number of different bodies, including planning commissions. And then there's a number of RCW citations.
Could we just slightly tweak the bullet then to say, while planning commission does not make quasi judicial decisions, MCR's overview on the appearance of fairness doctrine provides a useful reference for planning commissions, something like that.
Actually, I think I would make it even simpler and just add when considering quasi judicial or something like when considering quasi judicial decisions at the end of the sentence.
There is an opportunity for the planning commission to make quasi judicial decisions. However, we don't have a future land use map that differs from our current zoning map. Which is why every zone change becomes a comprehensive plan map, like land use map amendment. But if at some point in time in the future, we would love to not have a zoning map that aligns directly with a future land use map so that this body can make rezone decisions and or the hearing examiner can make rezone decisions.
We would make a binding decision on future
Well, it could
land
be
use.
hearings examiner even. As I'm saying this out loud, I'm like, oh, it might be hearings examiner.
But I think whether it's binding or not doesn't change our conflict of interest.
Yeah, but it does change appearance of fairness.
Mhm.
I don't think so. Cause we're still weighing in on if we're weighing in on a quasi judicial decision, then I think we're still covered by appearance of fairness.
I always thought that it was if our recommendation, if it was more than a recommendation, it was something that was binding, then appearance of fairness applies. But if we were doing, and that's kind of the dividing line between quasi judicial and just advisory. And if we stay fully in the advisory capacity, then of course OPMA and that kind of stuff applies, but not appearance of fairness.
If cause we did this beforehand.
Okay.
So we are required under appearance of fairness doctrine. When we're making a quasi judicial, even just a recommendation,
I don't think a recommendation could be quasi judicial is what I'm getting at.
our recommendation is quasi judicial. We are still, it's the appearance of fairness, not fairness. So we're still required, because if we're making let's say Eric wants to change the zoning on his property. And somebody comes in and applies and says, I want to change the zoning on this parcel.
That would be covered by conflict of interest, not appearance of fairness. And conflict of interest is something that it is binding over the planning commission. Because it doesn't matter if it's quasi judicial or advisory.
Would it be safe to say that the discussion that we're having right now about what constitutes quasi judicial would be remedied if, as Commissioner Nelson suggested, we simply appended the beginning when making quasi judicial decisions?
Yeah.
Whether we actually make them or not
Yeah,
is
that'd
kind of
be
irrelevant. We have it
fantastic.
in there in case we're ever empowered by the Board of County Commissioners to make them in the future.
I've already written that into my amended copy.
And Commissioner Nelson is right, of the list that's provided in the resource, the planning commission is not the decision maker. Like the example of projects that would fall into that category. But leaving the door open is a good idea.
It's like the one person subcommittee. It's a useful thing to have in there.
So just for me to clarify, so the amendment to that would be to add when making quasi judicial decisions at the end of that sentence, beginning.
Either one.
I'd put it, one at the end?
I would.
No,
I think it works better grammatically that way.
I like, okay, I'm a little Yoda-y in how I phrase things.
I'd make a motion to amend that sentence as we just said, to add when making quasi judicial decisions at the end of that sentence.
Second.
2 seconds. All right, any discussion on the amendment? All in favor?
I
Right, the motion is amended. All right, any further discussion on the motion as amended? Right, that, I will call for a vote.
Commissioner Bumbarger,
Aye.
Commissioner Fishburne.
Aye.
Commissioner Kaiser. Aye. Commissioner Bartlett,
Aye.
Commissioner Casino,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Right?
Commissioner Nelson,
Aye.
Chair Day.
Aye. All right. We have a new rule of procedure.
Big deal, decade in the making.
Thanks to subcommittees. All right, thanks everybody for that. Moving on to continued business, we have our second work session on the less restrictive alternative community housing code update. Rodriguez.
Hi, everyone. Anna Rodriguez again. Like the chair mentioned, second work session on the LRA Community Housing Code update. This is meant to be a discussion. I'm sure you saw, there are not many slides on this. Following up on some of the things you had asked for clarification on last time, and then just touching base on next steps. We already scheduled the public hearing last time, so that really is the biggest next step. Okay, to follow up on last time, there were a handful of things that the planning commission had asked questions about that we looked into, and I'm gonna bounce. Sorry, phantom mouse. I'm gonna kind of bounce around the order that's on here in the way that I think makes the most sense in my brain, so bear with me. Easiest to knock out is from the look I did online, McNeil Island is not closing, from what DSHS is saying. And most recently in 2023, their media relations manager indicated so. Should that happen, I'm sure it will be big news, but from what I searched, there's not anything indicating that that's more than kind of just a rumbling concern that people have, so easy on that one. And then secondly, we had a long conversation about transparency in the name that's used throughout, and also the name and the definition as well. We touched base with the respective people at the county that need to be involved in this conversation, and we can create a more transparent name. It's really just a policy decision on that front. The state, when talking about the privately contracted facilities, does use the term less restrictive alternative community housing, but there's nothing to indicate we're restricted to that name. So happy to report back to that. We're having, by we hire Ashley and hire folks are having conversations about those things and like what the name will be and what kind of direction the board may want to take on that from an optics standpoint. But good news is yes, you know, the recommendation that you had, it does seem like a possibility. Kind of following up on the transparency front with the definition, so long as it remains accurate, we can't change the definition. However, I don't recall us having much conversation on the definition piece last time. It was really more so about transparency in the name and the materials that we release to the public so that people actually know what's being discussed. You know, it was when it was being docketed, we were going through the docket process, it was clear from public comment that the name was a little misleading. People thought it was to get at middle housing or affordable housing in some way, and similarly to the concerns you raised last time. But just when I was reaching out to the folks, you know, the term can be changed. And as long as the definition is accurate, that can be tweaked too. As far as specifying the levels of the offenders in the definition, that is overreach on our part. State law indicates that we can't do that. So we are limited in that regard. We can't specify the levels of sex offenders that would be in these facilities. And then as far as the 24-hour supervision requirements, that also is an overreach. State law does not indicate that that is something that we can do. However, residents in these facilities are subject to pretty stringent monitoring requirements. So while we can't explicitly say they must have 24-hour supervision and we have to stick with the language that says they may have it, just because it's a privately contracted facility doesn't mean that these residents are not subject to the same kinds of monitoring that is required by the state.
And this is was this mostly like a Fair Housing Act
Yeah.
issue?
Cause these facilities too, you know, in the conversations about name and definition and stuff, these facilities aren't meant to stigmatize the folks. They need somewhere to go. And so it does tie into the fair housing piece.
I had a question on the specifying levels of offenders. Does it say explicitly in an RCW that that may not happen, or is this inferred, or what's the level of black,
I
is it
asked
black
someone
and white
who,
clear?
I asked someone who is an attorney. So they said so, and I took them at their word, but I'm happy to look into that further.
A state attorney from the
Our-
AG's office, or?
Our prosecuting
Oh, okay,
attorney.
gotcha, okay. That's a good source.
So we have had a little bit of delay in getting materials out because we wanted to be sure, as Anna highlighted, to work with the board, as well as the Public Information Office. And so we hope to start releasing information, probably under the name of state mandated sex offender housing. It's kind of what we're considering at this point and working with the Public Information Office. This Friday, or early next week. So
Could you
be on the
repeat
lookout for
that title?
State mandated sex offender housing, also highlighting less restrictive alternative in there somewhere so that there's a thread that ties them together. Because we are required to, refer to them as less restrictive alternative. But yeah, also making sure, to your point, that up front and center is who this less restrictive alternative housing is for, so it doesn't seem like we're hiding something. So we took to heart what you said. We're just running it through a few more channels. So thank you for giving us more time to do that.
State mandated is a good addition too.
Can you say that again, please?
State mandated is good addition too.
Yeah.
Indicates where the decisions get made essentially.
That it can't just be punted.
Yeah.
Have we heard anything from advocates of these offenders in terms of like the stigmatization aspect that you mentioned?
Not yet, but we also haven't released the broader information.
Yeah.
So we do expect, we know that there have been active groups at the state level as things are presented to the legislature. So yeah, I mean, we're also, just so you're aware, we're setting things up to try to protect our staff. So we're going to be using a general Thurston Planning email account to make sure if there are emails that aren't appropriate being sent, that, it's not causing harm to our individuals, our team. So we're trying to think ahead, and we appreciate you also, thinking ahead.
Did we get an answer on whether or not I guess setback's probably not the right word, but if we are able to, if state law says that these facilities can't be within 500 feet of a daycare, are we allowed to say more or less than that?
Did that come up?
I don't know, but I think considering the process that is required by both DSHS and Department of Corrections in determining these facilities, should someone kind of like with the, intent, I know this house is what's gonna be the facility. The process that DSHS and Department of Corrections would do, they would probably, if it were too close, they would deem it unacceptable. And I would imagine they wouldn't be able to use
Why-
that facility.
I guess where I'm going with it, if they deem it too close, might be different than
Can we increase citing?
does the
Fair.
county
Standards.
think that it's even closer than what they think?
I would assume that would fit under sort of land use zoning, and we've been told repeatedly by the PAO's office that we don't have any local control.
I would love to have that definitive answer on that, because this isn't like, kennels. Kennels can only be so close to daycares and everything. So if we have more control over those distances, I think that's an option that we should explore.
We can follow up on that.
That does actually get rid of one of my concerns is, which is the other end of that, which is is essentially trying, like, attempts to zone this out of existence in a way that is not actually in good faith for the intent of the law, the intent of the project. I would caution us not to create zoning restrictions that will be able to be used to just sort of keep this project forever indefinitely hovering in the air and prevent people from being able to get the housing that they're obligated to get by law. I don't disagree that it'd be useful to have some clarification on what we can and can't do, because I can see that coming up in a number of other circumstances where there's stuff that we're going to want to restrict. But I would like to maintain in the spirit of what this project is trying to maintain.
Another question. So, and maybe this is something that would have to go into building and development code and not policy necessarily, but when we're talking about, this would be a new special use that goes to the hearings examiner, and it would be a reclassification. So if somebody wanted to propose one of these to be in a residential area, it would then go to the hearings examiner and would be a reclassified use and would be converted to commercial. When it's commercial, will the laws on health and safety, including water, then be commercial or residential? Because if you take a house, that's a 4-bedroom house, and you then start putting 8 residents in there, how is that septic system water count going to work? Are we going to use commercial rules for the count on that septic system, or are we going to continue to use residential rules on that septic system?
We can confirm with public health. I think it's gonna be case by case depending on how many people are being housed. So it might be a little bit more nuanced, but we can follow up with Don Peoples and public health to see how they're classified.
To that, would we be able to say that if this facility is a 4-bedroom facility, then it's a maximum number of 4 participants?
Question.
Or,
So like max occupancy based on
yeah,
facilities?
So we're not just trying to cram.
yeah, so
people
they don't add
As much
15
money
people.
as
Similar to what
really
they do
possible
for
as a
elderly
corporate
housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we do have models for this. We
Right.
have group homes and
Group
other
homes and
things.
apartments and all that kind
And
of
so
stuff.
it's really just asking what rules
Would apply.
apply to those. And I think that falls in line with making sure that the housing that is provided is safe and meets minimum requirements, so.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind here is that this is not just a housing issue. This is a commercial venture. This is a business. And as such, it still needs to follow all the rules that other businesses need to follow, and other businesses aren't allowed to go over capacity. They're not allowed to overtax septic systems. They're not allowed to do a lot of stuff. So I want to make sure that they certainly don't get special dispensations.
Thank you for stating that.
All right, do we have anything else?
You all scheduled the public hearing for June, so, you know, kind of takes the zazz of my arrow, but just, June 5th, we'll be back for the public hearing, and like Ashley said,
I won't be here.
well, no, she won't.
Ooh.
It'll be me and Andrew. Amelia will be here too, but for another reason. But like Ashley said, the materials for release, if not end of this week, you know, legal ad going out early next week, they'll still be within the timeframe that are required.
Okay.
And so same with the press release as well.
We could give ourselves some buffer there.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, and moving on, next up is work session number 13 for Thurston 2045, Housing and Climate Chapter Analysis Update. It's like we've got the whole team on this one.
No, it feels like a drum roll. Well, we are really excited for you all to meet the consultant team, and we do have a blend of both members of the consultant Things you're working on housing as well as climate. And so I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Aneza to introduce herself. And Aneza, do you want to introduce your whole team?
Yes. Thank you, and thank you for having us here this evening. I'm Ferdous Oneza. I'm with Borg Consulting, and I'm the project manager for your Thurston County Comp Plan updates. And with me, we have Borg has also partnered with Cascadia. And I could move this to Megan. I see you there, and then Gretchen. Could you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Megan Lee. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate at Cascadia Consulting Group, and I'm supporting the vulnerability assessment for Thurston County, which is part of the resilience sub-element. I'll pass it off to Gretchen.
Not sure Gretchen is here,
No,
so.
I think Gretchen is here, but isn't made a panelist. So if that's
Oh, Tasha,
possible.
can you
You do that.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so she is okay, there she is.
Great. And it just said, I feel like I've won something. It said I was promoted to a panelist. So well, it's great to be here. Gretchen Muller with Cascadia Consulting Group, and I'll be supporting on the climate element presentation portion. And I'll turn it back to you, Aneza.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do, I would like to share my screen. So let me see if I can share without any interruption. So we have been, okay, so let me see. I am going to, wait a second. Okay, sure. So let's see. I don't know if you are able to see my screen.
Yep.
Okay. So you see it? You see it okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I know that it's showing the slides. If I go to the display mode, then it's gonna split and go to the another screen. So if this is okay, I'm gonna stick with this screen. If you're okay with that.
Works for
All
us.
right.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to go over what we are going to present this evening. So this is, you already have a housing element in your comp plan. We're updating that, and the climate element is a new element that would be added to your comp plan. So we are going to go over the tasks and objectives that are required by the state law. Very simple, we will just explain it in a simple way. I will promise I'll not go over all the legal language right now. And then we'll go with the overall approach, and then what we are finding out so far, and then we'll end with the next steps. With that, so you know that you have a GMA housing element, and there are certain requirements in the housing element already. But and you also know that the House Bill 1220 has changed some of the requirements of the housing element. And what it does is some of the policies you already had before, like have to provide housing for all income groups. So those were already in place. But what it does with this new regulations is it is grounding the requirements more into how you are actually implementing those, like how to the granular level, like how you are actually providing housing by income level, how, and in addition to that, like providing housing for emergency housing, emergency shelters, and permanent supportive housings. And then when you do that, how do you plan for land capacity? And then also, we all know that the GMA requires to have higher density in the UGAs, and then also housing availability. And another key aspect would be to look at racially disparate impact analysis as part of the housing. And then to look at displacement and exclusion of housing. And then based on that, you'll also update goals and policies. So that's an overview, but what your housing element will have based on those requirements You will have to, so your housing element would need, your comp plan will need a land capacity analysis, and I will go a little bit deeper into that. And then you'll have to have the housing need assessment to identify what are the housing needs in your community. And then when you have the needs analyzed and how do you provide them, that would be the adequate provisions. And then also look at the housing barriers and racially disparate impact analysis, and then update goals and policies. And parallelly, we would be doing the public engagement. And your county is doing a lot of public engagement extensively, so that would be also part of this process. So you already know that TRPC has preliminary housing allocations by income group. As you can see, that there are 0 to 30%, 30 to 50, 50 to 80, so all those income groups. And then permanently supportive housing and then emergency housing, those are also allocated. Those are allocated by each of the jurisdictions. And you see that this red area, that's where you have the allocation in the Grand Mount, UGA, and the rural areas that you have. We were also talking about land capacity, and why land capacity is important is because so you have the allocation for TRPC, but this is where the rubber meets the road. It's like, do you really have enough land? I mean, you could see in the map that you have enough land, but what does it mean? I mean, are those buildable? You want to protect all other GMA requirements like agricultural land, critical land, and all of that. So by complying all of those and then excluding all the unbuildable land, we need to find out that if you have enough land, and TRPC is performing that land capacity analysis that we're expecting to have by May, June timeframe. And then also there is a CPA environmental review process in parallel to that. So housing need assessment, when we're talking about need, this is more like, so needs are different for different communities and different population groups. So a community might have the first-time home buyers, they might have different need compared to a student or a family of 4 or 6 or a retired person. So we are going to look into and answer all these questions and then design or identify and analyze your need, and then identify the gaps and mismatches between your housing need and supply. And once we do that, then we do the adequate provisions, like we have your need and how do we provide housing? So how do we incorporate, like you have need for low-income housing, so how do we incorporate that? You have need for ADU or how do we actually address ADUs, accessory dwelling units, or you have need for elderly population, how do we provide those? So those are the things that we need to look into when we're doing the adequate provision analysis. I'm going to show you quickly, let's see, if I can switch to presentation mode, let me see if that gives you a better share or not. But what does it do is that does not actually, it switches to another screen. So it may not be able to go to the presentation mode. So maybe I'll just zoom it. No, that's not going to do it very well. Sorry about this. So
We have a big screen here, Oneza, so I think
okay. You're okay?
Yeah,
You're
we've
okay?
got giant screens.
Oh, awesome, awesome. All right, yeah, because when I go to the presentation mode, it switches the screen sharing to another screen. So I'll just go with this. Thank you. So so I wanted to show you what we have found in terms of housing so far. We did some data analysis. We compared Thurston County data with Washington State. And this is a data of population by age. So what it shows that county has similar age breakdowns as the states, but then you have a little bit higher elderly population. So the light blue is the state and then dark blue is the county. So you see that in this person 65 years and over, you have a higher percentage.
Yeah, just a second. We've got a question, if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Can I ask a
Yes.
question? The basic question is that, are we showing all Thurston County in these populations by age, or are we showing unincorporated Thurston County or the UGA or what?
So these ones are showing all Thurston County. We just took the data from census tracts.
Okay,
Is there an interest from the planning commission in breaking it down further?
I don't know why I would think that that's what we really need.
Especially if we gotta coordinate with the cities on some of these allocations.
Yeah, and the allocations are broken down, and so in
Yeah.
terms of aligning this.
The feedback we've gotten from the community is that those populations in a UGA, in a city, and in unincorporated Thurston County are distinct.
Right.
And so we would be doing a disservice if we weren't looking at that data separated out.
That's why we're coming to you early. So,
Okay, so point taken. So for now, these are all countywide data, and we were actually hoping to get some detailed map later on, but yeah, that's a good point. So let me go to the next slide. So this is also a comparison between Washington State and Thurston County. So as you can see that the dark is Thurston County and the light blue is Washington State. And what we can say is that Thurston County is a little less diverse than the state in general, with 80% white population. And then when we look at income and poverty, Thurston County's median income is slightly less than the state. But then when you look at the percentage of people in poverty, then Thurston County has less percentage of people below poverty. Foreign born status, you see that majority, like 92% of your residents are US citizens by birth. Race and ethnicity, that's the similar slide that you have seen just before, but this is just separating from the county data to show that your percentage or share of population, and then you see that Hispanic and 2 or more races, and Asian, those are some of the next level of race groups. And this is where we are showing the household types. So what it does is it is comparing between 2015 and 2020, 2020 being the highest, and you're seeing the population household types like elderly family, elderly living alone. And you can see that your elderly family that number has increased. Elderly living alone has increased. Small family has increased, but this is the highest increase among the elderly family. So the reason we are looking at this data is because this would help us identify what types of homes will be needed in future. Cost burden status again, this is a comparison between 2015 and 2020. And what it's telling us is the dark is the severely cost burdened and the light blue.
Maybe as many as 3 questions in the boardroom here,
Yes.
starting with Mr. Bartlett.
Could we go back one slide, please?
Yeah.
Okay, the question I have here is when we look at elderly family population,
Yes.
or elderly living alone, we've had a pretty robust increase in assisted family living facilities in Thurston County. So how does that information match up with that? I mean, we got 3 of them in Yelm, Washington alone. So how much of the elderly living alone or elderly family are living in these assisted living facilities versus living in a residence?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this category came directly from Chaz data from HUD, so we could definitely look into the breakdown. But I'm sure that these are somehow embedded into this total numbers, but we can look into that.
Commissioner Burrow.
Yeah, I had a question about other. So
That's a big category.
It is.
yeah, it seems to me that covers both people who are in a collective living situation that's not necessarily a family, people who are living alone but are not elderly. Those are two very different groups, sort of demographically, in terms of who we're looking at and for economic data. And it would cover a number of other things as well. I was wondering if you had any access to how to break that down a little bit more, because I think there's useful data in there.
Okay,
Yeah, it's the second highest after elderly. Smaller ones.
I'm not sure if it's possible, but I guess my question would be if we have a rough idea of the unhoused or underhoused population, it would be nice to see that on there and see how it is changing as well.
Yeah.
It would give useful context to
mhm.
what kind of growth it could potentially be seeing too. That's all.
Yeah.
Even another area of information that would be very useful, and maybe it's in the other or in small family categories. We have 3 institutions of higher learning in the county. And those are populations that are very underserved in housing and that we really need to consider. So if we can get any data on those numbers, that would be great.
Yeah, there's not enough dormitory capacity for
That's a good point, because they're always in the age group between 18 and 26.
Or even older sometimes.
Sometimes.
And also, I think I heard it mentioned, I think we'd want to be careful about using this as our indicator of what kind of housing we need looking forward. Because this is about housing that was available and who could afford it. And I think that's specifically what we're trying to affect.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Appreciate your input. So yeah, we're making a note of that for breaking it down further. And then we'll come back with the finer fine grain data. Should we move to the next one?
Yeah, please carry on.
Yeah. So this one, so the dark color is severely cost burden, percentage of people who are severely cost burden, and then the lighter blue is cost burdened, and then the gray is not cost burdened. And it's a comparison between 2015 and 2020. So if you look at owners versus renters, you can see that between 2015 to 2020, renters are more cost burdened, like severely cost burdened has increased from 22% to 23%, and then cost burden has increased 22% to 25%. Compared to owners, cost burden has reduced. So that's a finding based on this data. So let's go to the next one. So the language spoken at home, we looked at that because we'll show how that relates to other findings. But in Thurston County, 88% people speak only English at home, and there are other English speaking groups as well. And then we have poverty data, and then people below poverty who speak English at home. So English speaking people in Thurston County and non-English speaking. And the share of people, English speaking people below poverty is lower than the non-English speaking people in poverty. So that's another finding. Speaks English less than very well. That's a group, and we're doing that because we're looking at the racially disparate impact analysis as well, and we're looking at different groups who speak English less than very well. So basically, speaks different Asian languages, Spanish, and then other languages, Indo-European languages. So there are those language groups in Thurston County as well. Education by race. So this shows the educational attainment below high school by race. And what it shows is that so Black alone, people who are identifying themselves as Black alone versus white alone. So Blacks are more larger number of people compared to white population who have less educational attainment. So more people below high school in the Black race. Poverty by race, then we looked at poverty again, Black or African American, they have higher poverty than white. And then Hispanic population, they also have higher number of share below poverty. And then I also wanted to show you some displacement risk index maps, and I'm going to explain it a little bit. So this index map it has the underlying components to analyze where the county has the displacement areas. So, and I'll show you the breakdown in the next few slides, but what this map shows is a composite of all of that, and it shows that the Tenino area, the Grand Mount area has a possible displacement. It shows the possible displacement area, and then this area of this Sunset Beach area and the Nisqually area, these have like high displacement index as it shows. And the breakdowns here, so we looked at social vulnerability, we looked at a few other, but under social vulnerability, we looked at Black, Indigenous, and people of color, their location, and then also some other displacement index, for example, renters' share of their household, median household income. So we looked at those for the social vulnerability. So the dark colors are more vulnerable. So darker it gets, it's like it becomes more vulnerable. And then also we looked at demographic changes. So again, possible disinvestment. So it's as people are moving from one place to another. So the brown color that you see here, those are possible disinvestment areas. And then the light blue or pastel color, these are possible gentrification. And the other map that I'm going to show you, these are the market prices. So displacement might happen because of the market prices. So prices so too high, especially you already know that this area in the Eld Inlet area and Nisqually area prices are accelerating. So people are more likely to move to another area. And then some other areas like Tenino and Grand Mount, like prices are appreciating. So that's that. So that's all about housing overall approach, and then what we have found so far. We can have more questions now, or I can move this to Gretchen and she can talk about climate, and then we can also take more questions and discussion later. So it's up to you.
I think we had 2 questions. Well,
Yeah.
Sure. So I noticed we kind of having American Indian or Alaska Native alone as a demographic sort of appeared and disappeared depending on which graph we were looking at. But it seems to me that, especially when we were looking at poverty and a couple of these other ones where we're looking at like low-income housing, having access to that information about our Native members is really important. Because I suspect it's hidden in some of this other information. And if we're trying to provide low-income housing for the folks whose land we're on, I think that's something we need to be doing. Need to at least have the information on. That was my biggest thing that I just wanted to check in about. If we could consistently have that demographic in the information that we're looking at.
Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Kaiser.
Yes, could you please go back to the slide on displacement risk index?
Yeah. So we've got 4
There you
slides.
go.
So this is the composite one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about, you've got possible displacement, and then you've got high, moderate, low, and it's not entirely clear to me, is possible displacement the most likely? It's presented as if it is.
Yeah. So what this map is a composite of these 3 maps.
Oh, I see.
below.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So when we layer them all together and index them by numbering, that's when we get this map.
I see. And then on the displacement risk index,
Mhm.
demographic change map,
Okay.
bring
Yeah.
that up. I
Yeah.
was sort of chuckling at the very large brown area to the left, which is mostly state forest. And you have it marked as possible disinvestment, and I was contemplating what that might mean.
They're gonna cut all the trees.
That,
So,
It's black.
Fewer trees.
right, it's capital state
that's
forest.
that's a very good point. So what we do is like we give every parcel certain points, like numbers, and then indexing them. So maybe that's a very good observation then, because that makes sense. It's like why it's this, because the value probably didn't come up, but we will make a note and look into that more
Thank you.
closely. Yeah, thanks.
So I'm specifically curious about Exhibit 7, which was the Thurston County proportion of household by tenure and cost burden status. I know we're looking at the severely cost burdened, which is people who are paying more than 50% of the median family income. And then we have the cost burden, which is the 30 to 50%. I'm very curious about the 5 to 10% margin just above that. I think we're all aware that housing costs are going up, and how large a proportion of people are in that 10% buffer just after that. The people who are about to be cost burdened would be really useful. If that group is almost the size, or if it's significant, then that is a story we should definitely tell. If that group is quite small, that's also a story I feel like we should tell. Like, it's just this group of people, or it's about to be a lot more people. That would be very, very interesting for me. I know some cities offer housing vouchers up to or they're more generous, and it'd be useful for us to know, I should say.
Yeah.
Sorry, phrase that last little bit more articulately.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it. We can move
Okay.
on.
Can I just share one thing
Yeah.
about the land capacity analysis? I know we kind of hinted at that and hinted at this at prior meetings, but contracts have now been signed. The sustainable Thurston alternative will be done in parallel with the land capacity analysis based on the provisional housing allocations that you saw. And those two land capacity analyses and alternatives will be reflected in the environmental impact statement as the two scoping alternatives. So more to come, but I just wanted to confirm that both of those are moving forward.
How will the developer land analysis be broken down? UGA, unincorporated, GMA?
It'll be city, UGA, rural.
Okay.
So same breakdown that you saw for the housing allocations, but now there'll be a sustainable Thurston alternative.
Will we see a breakdown between zoning and use?
There are assumptions being made. I'm not sure exactly what it's gonna look like, but yeah, assumptions have to be made for every zoning designation.
I guess maybe I might have misstated that. It will show the difference between zoning versus use. Like, are we gonna see, is this analysis gonna be done on how things are zoned, or is this analysis gonna be done on how things are actually used?
It is a complex blend of both.
Okay.
Is my very limited understanding. We'll probably have to have Michael and Brogy come to explain the complexities at some point.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Let's go to Gretchen.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to be tag teaming tonight with Megan Lee, and we're going to be presenting on two of the sub-elements that comprise the climate element. So our section of this meeting, the goals are as follows on the next slide here. We can go to the next slide, please, Vanessa. To discuss with you all the scope of the work tasks and associated timeline, as well as generate a shared understanding of success in terms of what these two elements are, or these two sub-elements are, and what it looks like at the end of both the resilience sub-element and the GHG sub-element, and how they're packaged together into make the climate element. So we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the climate element goals, you'll see these up on the screen here, and rumor has it, it's very large on your screen. So in order to develop a climate element, where our North Star is captured on this slide. So a climate element that is compliant with House Bill 1181 requirements, that it's informed by data-driven analysis and inclusive community engagement, that it's integrated, that it speaks with other relevant plans and plans such as your mitigation and adaptation plans, that it's impactful towards achieving your county climate goals. So we're tracking closely to those, that it's supported by county staff, by key decision makers, by yourselves, by the community at large, and that it's clear, that it's feasible, as well as provides information needed to implement. So that it's an implementable plan, that it has legs and moves forward as part of your county approach to tackling climate goals. And with that, we've got one more slide here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Megan as well. So this is really a process slide. This shows each of the tasks and the subtasks that are in our scope for the climate element. And if you're working from the far right over to the left, where we end is with the climate goals and policies that are incorporated into your 2024 comprehensive plan. How we'll get there is with a climate mitigation sub-element, a climate resilience sub-element, as well as that robust engagement that we talked about. And the very first thing that we started with was a policy audit and a gap analysis. So what policies do you already have in place across relevant planning documents, and where there are some gaps or opportunities for both the resilience and the mitigation sub-elements. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan to do a deeper dive into our resilience sub-element. Then she'll turn it back over to me for task 5.4, which is the mitigation sub-element.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. So I'll quickly provide an overview of the approach we take to vulnerability assessments to ensure that we're not only meeting the Department of Commerce's minimum requirements for building out the climate element, but also going above and beyond to ensure we're effectively addressing the county's most pressing climate impacts and priorities for developing strong policies. So Neza, we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So just to quickly understand what climate vulnerability is, climate vulnerability describes the degree to which natural, built, and human systems are at risk of exposure to climate change impacts, so such as wildfire smoke, flooding, extreme heat, precipitation. In order to assess climate vulnerability, we take the sum of exposure and sensitivity and minus the adaptive capacity. And I'll explain what that means. So exposure, this indicates how much something or someone is at risk of being affected by climate change. So for instance, coastal areas facing sea level rise are more exposed to flooding. Sensitivity represents how much something or someone is likely to be harmed by climate change. So for instance, elderly folks may experience more health issues from extreme heat as compared to younger individuals. Adaptive capacity refers to the resources and capabilities available to deal with the impacts of climate change. So having access to tools like transportation, healthcare, health insurance can help someone's ability to adapt to climate impacts. So when we put it all together by looking at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, we can understand how vulnerable something or someone is to climate change. If exposure and sensitivity are high, but their ability to cope with those impacts or their adaptive capacity is low, then their vulnerability is high. Conversely, if exposure and sensitivity are low and adaptive capacity is high, then their vulnerability is low. So that's just an example of how we assess vulnerability. We can go to the next slide, please.
Megan, we've got a question, the boardroom.
Yeah.
Piggyback, yeah. On exposure, how are you determining that? Are you going back to 50 years of weather data and then looking at potential weather changes over the next 50 or 100 years? How are you assessing exposure?
Yeah, great question. So we do a mix of both. We look at historical historical climate data that is downscaled and also at the county level and state level. And then we also look at projections into the future. So we'll assess, for example, the impacts of wildfire smoke that have been historic. So as far back as that climate data is available, and then the projections into 2050, 2100, So that's kind of how we assess the exposure to those climate impacts.
How are you determining the future climate situation? What type of
Yeah.
scientific studies are you using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we kind of get into this in some later slides, but we use a mix of different most relevant climate data. So we heavily rely on the climate impact groups. Forget what the correct title is, but it's mapping for a resilient Washington. So that's one of the tools we use. The National Climate Assessment, their 5th annual report has just been released, and they use very updated CMIP 6 data models that have been proven to be the most up to date. So we're going to use that. So we use a variety of different data models and projections to assess exposure.
Okay. We have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question was kind of getting to what was already been asked about exposure. I'm curious how much of the forward-looking projection is your own work product and how much of it is existing work product? And if it's existing work from other folks, how are we weighting those sources and what are those sources?
Yeah, great question. So we do an in-depth document review, kind of like Gretchen mentioned earlier, of different adaptation plans, mitigation plans, comprehensive plans, plans that have hazard mitigation plans. And we look to see where critical assets and communities are and how exposed they are to certain climate impacts. And then we overlay that with like mapping tools. We also are going to do interviews with relevant city staff members to kind of fill in the gaps where we can't answer those questions with a strict document review. So we'll interview staff members from the water department, transportation department, building department, ask really specific questions to understand where their departments are experiencing impacts of climate change, where the most sensitive infrastructure they notice is. And then we'll also do some community outreach to get lived experience, not just the kind of data heavy models that we'll look at as well. And then the one last thing I was going to mention, what was it? Yeah, those are 3 methods. And I know there's one more that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but
just to clarify, there
Yeah.
is a list of the resources that you've used for your forward projections along with how they're weighted?
Correct.
Whereas-
We have a list. So
I guess if that exists, could the planning commission see that? I would be quite interested in that.
we're reviewing, we have a list of those in terms of the modeling and projections that we'll use. And in terms of their weight, there's not necessarily like a weighted scale that we're using or giving one document more weight over the other. It's more assessing how much level of the detail and like level of data there is available within those. But we look at them all equally. It's not one is weighted heavier than the other.
Gotcha. Then I guess just the list of data sources would be the most helpful then, with the assumption that it's all weighted equally.
Okay.
And just to highlight, in addition to what Cascadia has access to in terms of data sets, that is also being augmented by our own water services data team, because we have a lot more locally available data sets. So Cascadia has been collaborating really closely with like Kevin Hansen, Jade Cooley on our team as they're pulling together all of our local monitoring data, which is pretty fascinating.
I guess my concern is things like FEMA's sea level rise maps are lots of data. It's notoriously like way underestimating what a lot of people want or what a lot of scientists are predicting.
No, I think you just said it right, what people want.
Well, yeah, it's what people want. It's very optimistic. And if we're incorporating data simply based on its availability, not on its veracity, I worry that we might not be as resilient or we might not be assessing vulnerability to the best.
I would disagree. I mean, I found it just to be the opposite. I mean, we just went through a FEMA flood risk study for Thurston County. And their flood risk study was the opposite. It was over the top versus under. They put people in flood zones that have never flooded in 100 years, example.
They did just change their modeling,
Yes, I know.
but it's still conservative.
I think it's layering of lots of different data sets, so you don't have one driving.
I'm just curious what the
The
sources
next
are.
slide actually talks about some of those sources.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it's okay.
no, this is a great conversation. And I'll say too that we rely heavily on the most up-to-date climate models and climate projections. So whatever climate projection is the most up-to-date is what we're going to be using. Just to say that. Just for
Then
there.
we had one
But
more
I think-
question, then we'll let
yeah.
you.
Yeah, sorry. I just, this'll, I'll say this once because otherwise I'll just keep saying it. It's tied directly to this, which is that, I'm also concerned about buffers. So like we're consistently finding out that the information that we have about climate change, about, fire risk, about these things is worse than the models that we've had before. And since we're trying to put in a long range plan, I would appreciate it if there was a certain level of, and I'm sure that you have some, I'd be interested to find out what it is, a certain level of buffer of protection, you know, in terms of like, if we're trying to build climate mitigation strategies here, it is better to be pretty to be overprotective rather than underprotective.
Safety factors.
Yes, exactly. So I was just curious about what kind of buffers you had in place in terms of making sure that we're actually covering our butts in the future.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to check with my advisor on this. His name's Mike Chang. He's leading the vulnerability assessment. So I can't give you a good answer now, but can definitely follow up with you in an email. Yeah. Unless Gretchen, did you have anything? Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll circle back on that along with the list of resources that we're using.
Okay. Should I keep moving?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, cool. So our initial step to crafting a climate vulnerability assessment is to understand the current and anticipated climate impacts within Thurston County. So kind of what we just spoke about. And this aligns with step 1 of Commerce's guidance in developing the resilience sub-element, which involves assessing climate impacts and documenting applicable hazards, indicators, and impacts. So like I said, we'll leverage the climate impacts climate mapping for a resilient Washington web tools to establish a baseline understanding of the anticipated climate impacts across various sectors in Thurston County. And I'll go over what these sectors are in the next slide. And then we'll complement data from the climate impacts group map with other downscaled and localized data sets to gain a full picture of the climate impacts affecting Thurston County. Concurrently, oh, sorry, can you go back? One more. Great, thanks. Concurrently, we'll conduct a review of existing county documents, such as a comprehensive plan, hazard mitigation plan, and adaptation plan. And this process will enable us to identify and document critical climate hazards, impacts, and assets, while also assessing the extent to which current policies support resilience efforts. So this will really help us highlight where current planning gaps are in terms of priority hazards and assets and resilience. We'll also solicit input from technical experts through focused discussions, so those staff meetings, like I mentioned, to ensure a well-rounded understanding of climate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity within the county. Following that, we'll develop summaries of climate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And these summaries will serve as a foundation for prioritizing specific climate hazards and assets within the resilience sub-element. And then ultimately, these findings will be shared with the client team for your review. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. So our team has worked to select 5 focus areas for the vulnerability assessment. We selected these focus areas because they align closely with the existing comp plan elements, and they're set up well to assess vulnerability against. So these sectors are human well-being and emergency management, ecosystem and water resources, infrastructure, community design, land use and economic development, and natural resource lands in rural economy. There's subtopics, is what I'm calling them, under each focus area that we'll dive deeper into, which comprise those focus areas, which I won't read because there's kind of a lot of them, but those are the high level 5 focus areas that we'll be focusing our vulnerability assessment on. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please.
Question?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, where do fisheries come in on this? Cause I don't see that. I see agriculture and forestry. But we have a pretty significant shellfishing industry here.
Yeah, we can definitely, yeah. Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. We can definitely add that under natural resource lands and rural economy. Be sure to add that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So this slide kind of goes through our methodology for conducting the vulnerability assessment. We're going to be using, as I said, various data sets to look at the relative vulnerability of assets and communities across Thurston County and across those 5 focus areas. So we'll be assessing the spatial distribution of how climate change will affect county assets, ecosystems, and communities. And the reason generally why we're taking this multi-method approach is to ensure that the VA is defensible and aligns with the broader literature, while also acknowledging that Thurston County has unique climate vulnerabilities. So there's 3 components of the VA that we're anticipating to use. First is the social and economic vulnerability assessment, which measures the community and the economy's vulnerability to climate impacts. So this usually looks at the well-being and emergency management focus area. So access to amenities, public health, emergency preparedness, things like that. And then we'll look at the physical vulnerability, which is an analysis of different physical assets in the county, which will look at open spaces, parks, transit infrastructure, and how they're exposed to various climate impacts. So sea level rise, heavy precipitation, urban flooding, extreme heat. And we'll be focusing on the impacts of the assets that are most pertinent to the county, as identified through our baselining, so our step number 1. We'll also address how cascading and compounding climate impacts play into the county's overall vulnerability. So compound events result from occurrences of multiple climate drivers or hazards, either in an individual location or across multiple locations that, when they're combined, have a greater impact than just isolated hazards. And socioeconomic stressors like poverty and lack of adequate housing that disproportionately impact overburdened communities, coupled with climate stressors, can deepen existing societal inequities, creating this compound effect. So we'll be sure to look at that interplay to effectively address climate equity in the sub-element. The last thing I'll note, because I know this was mentioned earlier in the meeting, but we're going to be expanding the scope of the VA to include unincorporated Thurston County, just to state that explicitly. That was it for the presentation. I know we have some discussion questions that I believe we still have some time for. Okay, great. So the first, or I guess I'll open it up to general questions first. See if there's anything.
Thank you. Just to come back on the mention of shellfish.
Yeah.
It's not just shellfish, it's also salmon and trout fisheries. We have actually in our region in Thurston County, some of the most famous oysters right now in the world in terms of quality, and it's directly linked to water quality. So that is an absolutely critical resource to consider. We have 3 tribes who fish and harvest shellfish. So it's cultural, it's historical, it's economic, it's environmental. It's really a foundational area of concern for us. And I guess the second thing I'd mention is our forestry. We have a huge amount of our county is forested, and there's individual landowners, there's state landowners. We have vulnerability there in terms of biomass on the ground, especially in our state forests. They haven't been well managed, and we have great potential for wildfire as our temperatures rise. So I think that's a really specific, unique area that it would be great to have you guys pay some attention to.
That's great. Yep. We'll look into that for sure. Thank you.
Get all of our questions out of the way during the presentation.
We do that, don't we?
It was good. Up front, love it.
Oh, good.
I guess I would say, I realize a lot of at least the financial stuff from earlier, dealt really heavily with comparing 2015 to 2020. And I think we're all very aware that costs and the price of everything between 2020 and now has not been on a normal or historic track. And so I understand that we're only looking at what we've got, which is probably going to be a little dated since we're dealing with mostly census data probably for economics, but we do know good Washington data about consumer price index. And it'd be interesting to see, could we apply that to get some sort of projection to maybe what 2025 is? Because I don't really feel like we're even working off of a current state when we're looking at the number of people who are cost burdened, right? I feel like if we took, I think 2020 to now is 22%, 29% for Washington state since 2020. I don't know specific to the county, but that's a huge change. And that chart could look very different if it was done with right now data. And I just want us to go in eyes open about where the needs are. Commissioner Barton.
Yeah, I have 2 points. The first was regarding the combination here of climate change and land allocation for housing. I know that a lot of our already urban real estate is soon to be oyster real estate. It is not long for this land. And I do have concerns that those areas are going to end up becoming, because they're untenable as long-term land sources, they're going to become a sink for low-income housing. So I want to really be careful about when we're talking about how where we're placing housing, and we're talking about how we want to look at it, that we take into account the combination of people who cannot move frequently, who can't afford to move frequently, and climate stable housing. Someone who can afford waterfront property right now can also afford the new waterfront property, rather than their old home becoming waterfront property. Is one of my concerns. The other one is I was interested when we're talking about climate mitigation. A lot of it in Thurston County, we have a few different sources of carbon sinks that are really valuable. One of them is old growth forest. One of them is largely a restoration effort, but is kelp forests and large marine mammals. And another is our prairies. All of those are things that may or may not be possible to restore once developed. So they are things that we need to take into account with this building plan in terms of making sure that while we are trying to mitigate carbon use in other ways, we are also maximizing our carbon sinks and taking those into account. This is all going to end up coming down to counties and states. Like, we have, what, 10 years to figure this out. So just wanted to put that out there.
Great. All right, thank you, folks. So let's move into these discussion questions. So the first one we have, and this is again specific to the resilience sub-element. So talking about vulnerability and talking about adaptation, and we'll get into mitigation in a second once Gretchen takes over. But with the eyes of vulnerability and adaptation, are there any specific considerations, so critical assets, areas of concern, or community groups that we need to pay particular attention to when it comes to future climate impacts? And the reason we're asking this, again, like we have the documents that we can refer to, but you guys have lived experience that the documents might not speak to. So that's why we're trying to assess that here.
I think one asset I would be interested in seeing is some segmentation of stormwater, well, basically development when development occurred, which will give you a sense of whether or not, or like what level of stormwater management we have. So specifically the age of development is going to tell you a lot about what kind of stormwater management you're going to have in different areas, which will tell you a lot about the vulnerability of those in changing climates.
Great.
Specifically, like 1990 would be the cutoff use. Before and after.
Okay.
And I already mentioned my concern here about underrepresenting Native groups in this, so. And Daniel mentioned underhoused folks.
Are there any areas in the county that you've noticed experience flooding more heavily than others, or heat islands are more prevalent?
Well, everything from the Pines and Yelm going out to the Nisqually Delta, the Nisqually River has been, I mean, I don't want to invoke Howard Glassstetter here, but the Nisqually River has been very problematic to eastern Thurston County.
And that's more of a situation of people building homes where they shouldn't.
But they're already there.
I
So what
know.
do we do with them now?
But it's basically, they were always a flood zone. They've always been in a flood zone. And people choose to build in a flood zone. They choose to rebuild in a flood zone. It's not a matter of the river having more water in it than ever before. That's not the case. I mean, I've been here for 50 years and I've fished that river and the Deschutes, and I've been monitoring lake water levels for over 50 years in this county and working with NASA and everybody else on it. And we're not seeing much of a change. So it's basically where people are building and where they're rebuilding where they shouldn't be. And that goes to code and land use. More than anything else. That's just my opinion. I mean, I've been a frontline observer for 50 years on this.
I think it'd be fair to say that the people that are displaced by flooding in the Nisqually River are generally in the lowest quintile of the economic range, not the highest quintile of the economic range. And considering that, we should make sure that those people are not adversely affected as much as possible.
Commissioner Kaiser.
In the area of stakeholders, organizations, you might consider checking in with the Evergreen State College, which has a climate center. And you may also connect with the Capital Land Trust, which is focusing more and more on conservation easements that positively affect not only conservation goals around habitat, but carbon storage.
Oh, great.
Land trust.
Yeah, and the Nisqually Land Trust as well.
Okay.
Commissioner Bartlett.
Yeah, I think that something that is important in this conversation that was happening sort of on this side of the table is like, yes, people have for whatever reason been building in areas that are just going to end up getting flooded consistently. They are still people. They are still people who have needs that they're our constituents. So it sounds to me like part of our modeling should be, how do we help people, how do we assist folks like that get out of those flood zones and into areas that are affordable to them elsewhere in the county? It's just my thought on that. And then actually, I'm gonna just let Tina talk.
I just have a quick point. So I work in insurance regulation and I can tell you, the people who tend to have the best modeling on things like wildfire risk are the people who have a financial interest in it.
Indeed.
It's not an academic exercise, it's brass tacks, this is the real thing. So there are large data sets on wildfire risk that exist for insurance company use. Those can be purchased through large data brokers like Milliman and stuff. Those might be useful to do a more realistic look at risk in those areas. Just throwing that out there as a possible avenue for modeling data that you might not have explored.
And my second part was just like, we had folks who came in this morning, whenever we started this, the first time. The morning of this meeting, at the beginning of the meeting, who are deeply steeped in the local climate situation. Can you remind me the name of your group?
Our group?
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
My name
Actually, yeah,
Oh, the group, Thurston Climate Action Team.
thank you. So the Thurston Climate Action Team, and you said your name was Bob Crawford?
Tom.
Tom Crawford, thank you. They were speaking to exactly this stuff, so it seemed relevant.
Yeah, with the question, which community groups do we need to pay particular attention to?
Thank you.
Great. All right, I think if there's no more discussion to be had, I think we can move on to the greenhouse gas section of this, Gretchen, if that works for you.
Yep, that sounds great. And if any other questions come up, we'll likely have a little more time at the end to address whether it's the housing element or the two sub-elements of the climate element as well. So great. So with that, I will go ahead and get started here. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the approach for the greenhouse gas sub-element, and we'll get into some of the detail just related to the approach. So no data that we're presenting to you all tonight, that'll come at a future meeting. So for this first slide here, the Washington Department of Commerce provides really detailed guidance for the greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-element, and we're following that really verbatim here. And the objective of the sub-element is to measure, to reduce, and to eliminate local greenhouse gas emissions and per capita vehicle miles traveled through comprehensive plan goals as well as policies. The goals and policies need to work toward an overall greenhouse gas emission reduction target of net zero emissions by 2050 on both the total as well as the per capita basis. And we'll talk about this goal a little bit later here as well. And the guidance also stipulates that goals and policies should address at a minimum greenhouse gas emissions related to the transportation, to buildings and energy, as well as zoning and development sectors. So those are the key sectors there that you see on the screen. You can go to the next slide, please. And here you'll see the minimum requirements that are captured from the Commerce guidance. And Commerce specifies 3 requirements for the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element. The first one here, the sub-element policies must reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions within jurisdictions without increasing emissions elsewhere in Washington. The second you see on the screen here is the sub-element policies must reduce per capita VMT without increasing emissions elsewhere in Washington. See a theme here. And the third, the sub-element policies must prioritize reductions that benefit overburdened communities to maximize co-benefits. Next slide, please. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Vanessa. So the Commerce guidance provides 3 different pathways for meeting these requirements of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element, which range from less to more detailed analyses. And the third pathway here that we've got the line drawn to is the pathway that we're going to take with Thurston County GHG sub-element. And that's required to create a GHG emissions reduction sub-element, which includes Thurston County. So that's the pathway that we're capturing and that we're following as per the guidance from Commerce. Next slide, please. And Commerce provides 4 basic steps for developing a greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-element. The first step here involves identifying all local emission sources. Step 2 calls for setting emission reduction targets. Step 3 is developing measures and an implementation plan to achieve those emission reduction targets. And then the final step captured on the slide here calls for integrating those measures into the comprehensive plan and evaluating progress as a plan is implemented. So that gets at the implementability of this sub-element. So we're going to do a deep dive into each of these steps here. So for step 1, our approach to developing Thurston County's GHG emissions reduction sub-element follows the steps that I'm going to lay out. So the development of a 2022 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and it's currently underway right now, which includes the development of a community-wide as well as government operations GHG emissions inventory. We're going to draw from this inventory to identify GHG emission reduction targets, aligning with current county targets as well as Commerce recommendations. And our approach to developing sub-element measures and an implementation plan will draw from a variety of different sources, including public and stakeholder engagement, an audit of existing county climate policies. We've already conducted the policy audit. And that also included the looking at and doing as part of the policy audit, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. So dove back deeply into that document, as well as updating the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, vehicle miles traveled analysis, a menu of measures provided by Commerce specifically for the sub-element, and a GHG scenario analysis, which we call a wedge tool that can visualize the GHG impact of various climate strategies such as energy efficiency improvements and vehicle miles traveled reductions. And these measures will then be incorporated into a draft GHG emissions reduction sub-element. And the key pieces of that it's integrated across comprehensive plan elements across the various elements, that it coordinates various county departments and agencies, and that gets at the implementability of it, and provides a plan for emission monitoring as well as reporting.
We've got a question in the boardroom, Gretchen.
Great. And we'll see where, I hope I can answer it. I am channeling my colleague, Andrea Martin, who's on vacation this week, who is leading this work. But if I can't answer it, I'll get a response back to you.
Pretty simple. It's going back to our first presentation and asking the basic question. Determine scope and scale and identify local emission sources. From where? From all of Thurston County wide, unincorporated Thurston County, the UGA, what?
So what is the scope of where we're pulling the emissions from, and how are we defining? It sounds like the question is, how are we defining community-wide inventory? Is that your question?
Well, my question is, we need to have it broke down so that we can provide our county commissioners the scope of work for what they can influence, which is unincorporated Thurston County.
Yep, okay. Great, point taken. We're capturing all the notes as well. We've got a notes document going on the screen here. So thanks for that comment.
Yeah, I mean, to give us the scope as to all of Thurston County is really not appropriate for our Board of County Commissioners or for our comprehensive plan. We've got, like Commissioner Kaiser said, we've got a state forest that consumes a large part of Thurston County. We have JBLM, which has a huge area in the prairie area of Thurston County. And then we have a large, that they have no control over or no influence over. And then we have 3 tribes with their own tribal properties that we have no control over. So when you exclude all of that, and that is in unincorporated Thurston County, then what do we have left that we can influence, that we can get our Board of County Commissioners looking at?
Forgot the National Wildlife Refuge.
There you go.
I will say there are a number of existing policies in the comp plan, and the Planning Commission can entertain new ones as well that speak to partnering with our state agencies or JBLM. And so I wouldn't say excluding all of those from
I
consideration,
didn't say excluding, but I
but
said
understanding the interplay.
you have to
and-
understand what portion is the Board of County Commissioners' responsibility in unincorporated Thurston County versus other entities that they have to partner with.
Thanks. Colin?
Yeah, I had actually a little bit, I had a heavily overlapping question, but which is basically around those entities that we can partner with, those avenues towards partnership or what have you. When we are looking at increasing emissions elsewhere in Washington, a lot of those overlap entirely or overlap pretty partially with us. So if we're talking about wanting to partner with the Nisqually Nation or someone like that, and we're talking about, I want to make sure that our emissions cutting isn't being double counted by groups that are also partnering with those same organizations on other sides in other counties. That we're not essentially just all using the same imaginary carbon sink.
That's a good point.
So-
Commissioner Castillo?
I would hope that when you're doing an inventory actually is on a pretty granular level that actually says where these things are happening. So that way we can differentiate between, if this is actually something within county's purview and our comp plan would effectuate it, or if it's something that is happening that we have no hands on.
Yeah, like county facilities a lot of, like the building we're in is actually located in a city. So I do think there is going to be a blend when you look at emissions in terms of what the board, county commissioners.
I'm just hoping it doesn't come out that it says Thurston County has this much greenhouse gas. That's not terribly actionable on our part. Yeah, we need it a little bit finer detailed than that, and I'd hope that the word inventory would imply that.
So two quick things. Buildings and energy, which is 54% of this chart. I feel like that is too broad to be useful for us. I've sort of going off of your point. And to Commissioner Halverson's point, the transportation, I don't feel like should be segregated out from the county. Most people who live in the UGAs work in the cities, right? And emissions don't just happen where you live, they happen all through your travel path. I do think though, particularly for the building and energy, that makes sense to segregate out to the actual areas where the Board of County Commissioners has real authority to make changes. That's just my point.
All right. Thank you, Gretchen. You can carry on.
Keep going to step 2. Great, so we can go to the next slide, please. Great, so we're going to draw from this inventory to identify greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, aligning with current county targets as well as commerce recommendations. Go to next slide, please. So here we got step 3, which is our approach to developing the sub-element measures as well as an implementation plan. It's going to draw from multiple sources, as I mentioned. So public stakeholder engagement, as well as that policy audit that both Oneza and I spoke to earlier. An updated GHG emissions or greenhouse gas emissions inventory, as well as that VMT or vehicle miles traveled analysis, the menu of measures, as well as the scenario analysis wedge tool for that visualization piece. So speaking to all the components. So that culminates with these measures being incorporated into a draft GHG emissions reduction sub-element. And as I mentioned, that it's the core elements there are that it's integrated into the other elements so that this sub-element speaks to the other elements, that it coordinates various county departments and agencies. So where to one of your comments about kind of who has kind of authority over or the work within which some of the recommendations will fall. And so making sure that those county departments and agencies and associated agencies are at the table from the very start, and that it provides a plan for emission monitoring as well as reporting. So that's the approach, and I appreciate all of your comments as well as just some of the needs in terms of the most helpful level of granularity, and we can speak to those pieces in future meetings here. And great, and so we're going to go ahead to the next slide, please. We also have a few discussion questions for you all. And again, very high level summary of the planned approach. And as we embark on this work, we're really hoping to hear input at various key stages of this process from you all. And so specifically, one of the pieces, and you all may have seen this in your meeting packet here, but hearing from you all on a recommendation around the emission reduction target. So your current mitigation plan, the reduction is 45% reduction by 2030, 85% reduction by 2050. As per the Commerce guidance, there's a recommendation to be net zero by 2050. So that's different than what's currently in the Thurston County mitigation plan. So I would love for you all to consider that. And would be great to hear some input on that today if you all feel ready to share. And then the next question that we have is what kinds of measures and policies are highest priority when you're thinking about the sectors that I talked about, whether it's transportation, whether it's buildings and energy, zoning and development. What are some of the kinds of measures and or policies that really rise to the top from your vantage point? And the third question here is which stakeholders, this will look familiar from what Megan presented, but stakeholders, organizations that are crucial to engage around these policies as well. And obviously we'll take a look at the ones that you all have already mentioned and flagged for the resilience sub-element. Likely we'll talk to those groups too, but if there are any others that you think are particularly relevant to the GHG sub-element. So with that, would love to hear, I know I just rattled off all 3 of the questions all at once, just to get you guys excited. I know it's 8:35 on a Wednesday night here, But so going back to that first question, the recommendations for the emission reduction target, would love to get any initial thoughts, reactions to potentially a revisit of that emission reduction target to net zero by 2050.
Commissioner Halverson.
Yeah, I just, I didn't hear anything in your presentation on one of your goals, which was feasibility. One of the goals is that the plan has to be feasible moving forward. And one of the criteria for feasibility is not just policy and CPED involvement with zoning ordinances and stuff like that, but it's budget. Thurston County already has a issue with budget. And so where is that going to play in it? I mean, we recommend for emissions reductions target current 45%, 85% by 2050. What you have to understand is you got to go out to 2050 and figure out what the county budget might be in 2050 if we implement all of this stuff. And is it feasible, what we're planning to implement, which we don't know what we're planning on implementing right now. I'm just saying, I didn't hear anything about feasibility in this analysis.
Yeah, so in terms of the process in terms of the analysis and kind of the modeling that's done around emissions, there isn't an economic piece to that. But in terms of the policies and recommendations and what rises to the top, that's part of the conversation. So we often do what's called multi-criteria analysis and kind of score for things like feasibility, and that's factored in there in terms of which recommendations rise to the top, and that's part of the conversation.
So what I'm hearing, and just providing feedback, is this plan will provide recommendations on how to get to this, the GHG emissions reduction portion mandated by the state. And these recommendations will be rank ordered, and the Board of County Commissioners will have to take and figure out which ones they're going to implement based on the budget they have.
They'll be the lens that we're looking through is highest impact on emissions reductions. So, and we have, based on a lot of the climate action planning that we've done around the state, have a really good sense in terms of, for lack of a better term, kind of biggest bang for your buck, highest impact. There won't be a detailed economic analysis that goes along with this sub-element, but we do have, a sense in terms of kind of the impact on the emission side of things, and with, an eye on feasibility as well. But an in-depth economic analysis is not part of this sub-element.
I will point out that, so $800,000 was allocated to Thurston County to do climate work over the next few years. We're only using a portion of that on the update to the climate element and reserving most of it to do those kinds of more in-depth feasibility analyses once we know what those vulnerable areas are, projects are. So, and that was an intentional decision based on planning commission feedback that let's really focus on action and try to figure out how to get these projects out on the ground.
Some dreams, goals and policies have to get you some. Mr. Casino.
Well, along the same lines as Commissioner Halverson and what has just been said, since we know that all of these policies cost money, and it would be great to, get the best bang for the buck, I think that local policy decisions that we have influence over, we should consider who is going to be bearing the brunt of those financial impacts. And I personally think that the first people in this group that need to be paying these impacts are governmental entities, how we operate as a county and how the cities operate and all that kind of stuff. They're the first ones that need to reduce and bear costs. And then after that would probably be commercial entities of some sort or another. And the last people that I want impacted by these policies are lower income residential housing users, because it will affect them the most negatively. So I don't want to, if we go through and do a whole bunch of zoning and development restrictions in hopes that it's gonna reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, I think and that negatively impacts low-income housing. I think that is misguided. We need to push those costs up before we push them down.
Yeah, and just a couple of things to point out there. So co-benefits is a huge emphasis in the commerce guidance, as well as embedded within our approach, as well as unintended impacts too. So those are things that we're looking at throughout this process as well. And as part of the making sure that unintended impacts, when we're looking at a set of recommendations, high priority recommendations, that those unintended impacts and potential burdens on certain communities or certain geographies or whatever it is are factored in there. So that's a great point. Thanks for sharing.
Sure, so I have a kind of a question on what priorities, I don't know, what kind of measures and policies are highest priority? When we're talking about transportation impacts, are we basically saying tailpipe emissions? Are we saying like at the car level? Or at the vehicle level? Or are we looking at it holistically? So I would imagine going forward, use of alternative energy source vehicles expands. If we're only looking at tailpipe emissions, we didn't actually stop the carbon from being produced, right? Energy still had to be generated somewhere to either fractionate hydrogen or, generate and transport power. So if it's basically just looking at tailpipe emissions, I feel like transportation might be a fun way to make our numbers look good and meet our goals, but I don't know how effective it is if we're not looking at where the energy is coming from, how we're transporting it and whatever. So that might put buildings and energy at a higher priority in my book.
I think that if transportation also includes roads and parking lots and 1/3 of urban spaces dedicated to cars, that really throws that number off.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I mean, I am sympathetic to the economic concerns that are being brought up. I do think that that's going to be more of a matter of us figuring out where else we can, like, using the data that's given to us to figure out where else we can make that those adjustments happen. Because I mean, we can't make or save money on a dead planet if we are flooded out, or if we are burned out, or if we are going through any of the things that we're about to be going through, or if we're just crowded out because we're the last habitable space left. All of those are things that are going to directly affect us. So we have to do what we can within the scope of our abilities, within the scope of our jurisdiction and budget, to make sure that we bring that number as close to zero, as close to before 2050 as we can. And I look forward to finding out what our strategies are going to be on that. I look forward to working with other groups on that, but I think that this is the priority that makes all of our other priorities possible.
Any other comments, questions, as you look at these 3 questions here around considerations around that net zero, potentially changing the emissions reduction target to net zero by 2050 instead of where it currently is at that 85%. And then any other measures or policies that really rise to the top there, and or groups that you think we need to reach out to.
I don't think you're gonna get an answer on where we're going to be as far as a reduction target until the study is completed and we find out what needs to be done, how much it's gonna cost, and we help the commissioners prioritize those costs moving forward.
There are 3 legislators in Thurston County who are very active on these topics. One is Representative Andrew Barkus, who's on the Transportation Committee. He's also been involved with some really interesting proposals on housing. The other would be Representative Jessica Bateman, and then Representative Beth Dolio. They're all really focused on these issues. They are all Thurston County folks, and you really should connect with them at some point.
I could be wrong here, because I am not a commerce person, but net zero is sort of a squishy term, right? It's saying however much you reduced minus however much you're absorbing, and how you figure out how much you're offsetting.
Yeah.
Can be really flexible based on how you interpret it. I think in my book, I would be more comfortable with a fixed percentage reduction because that's tangible and it's a hard number, right? Whereas net zero, like you can do some sort of euphemistic math or reconsider certain assets, and that makes me a little, yeah.
Maybe sell some credits to other counties.
Yeah.
Commissioner Bartlett.
Actually, I had a follow-up to that, which is, I mean, when we're looking at 45% versus 85% versus net zero. So net zero is not 100%. Net zero is what you just described, but I'm making sure that we're being clear that 85% is not 85% of net zero. That those are meaningfully different numbers. And I would be interested in finding out from folks what our actual necessary minimums are. I mean, obviously, I know that we need to get to a real net zero by a certain deadline, but like, is a real net zero better or worse than or a functional net zero better or worse than a 85% reduction? That's clarification that I need.
Okay. I can share that with Andrea. And I think to one of the commissioner's points too about kind of needing to see it, the wedge analysis will be that visual that you all will get that shows where you all are in terms of emissions across these various sectors, categories, and that 85% where you need to be, kind of where that gap is or where the wedge is, and then potentially could also run that for net zero as well and see the difference on the wedge.
That'd be great. Thank you. And then I guess my last question was just when we're looking at, and this is again about double counting to a certain degree, but when we're talking about areas that are protected areas that might be considered buffers or things like this. I brought this up at the last meeting, but those are areas that themselves are being impacted by climate change, that themselves are going under. And so if we're counting on a certain acreage of salt marsh or forest to exist, to be able to be our carbon sink, it would help. It would be helpful to make sure that we took into account that will in fact exist in the 2050 that it's supposed to be protecting us during. I would like to see these models themselves look at stuff that is climate flexible in terms of its protection. And I know that we'll be coming back to climate buffers later, but that's something that I want taken into account is climate buffers for ecological shifts.
Yeah, and I can get a little more information too from Andrea about the concern around double counting and how we factor that in and address that. So we can circle back on that one.
Thank you.
Now we have a couple more slides related to next steps, but just want to see if there are any other hands in the room or any other kind of final comments related to the approaches that we just walked through for both the resilience sub-element and the GHG sub-element.
I think we're all clear.
Thank you. I unmuted myself and then realized I've got a couple talking points before I turn it over to you, Oneza. So this is really where we are on the timeline scale of things. So we are, Megan and Mike and team are working fast and furiously, but thoroughly on the VA document, so the vulnerability assessment document review right now. And our greenhouse gas team is also working on the inventory as well as that vehicle miles traveled, the VMT analysis, and that's through June. And then we, in May, are conducting interviews with relevant staff members, and that should actually say May and June, because May for GHG conversations, and then it's June for the vulnerability assessment. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Oneza.
Just one question, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your finalized VA document review is that similar to your gap analysis of the documents?
And yeah, thank you. I just saw Megan unmute and I'm gonna let her speak to that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I feel like finalized isn't potentially the right word, but just to say that we'll have reviewed all the documents and identified gaps where, yeah.
Any other questions on climate next step? So under housing, we have already been working in both climate and housing elements. And what we are already doing is we're conducting a housing need assessment. And that's some of the snapshots of data that you just saw. And we will update those based on your comments. And we will be working, and we will bring, like in May, June timeframe, we are working on those and bring back some more information to you in terms of our analysis. And also you're performing racially disparate impact analysis right now, and you've seen the map, so we will also fine tune that. We know that county is doing an extensive public outreach for comp plan. So we are a part of the housing element and climate element. We are, especially for housing, we're plugging in where your comp plan elements are already outreach process is already in place. So we are supporting the county whenever it is needed. So that's gonna be our next steps, and you will see, we'll be back to you with more information and more analysis in the June timeframe. I mean, of course, May, June, and July in those. So here are some outreach and engagement, and so these are some meetings that are already planned. And Gretchen, if you wanna chime in, please go ahead. And you'll see that we have the climate engagement, and we have the major community engagements in June. And then, yeah, so this is going to be an ongoing process.
So is this team doing these engagements, Ashley?
So the forum or the summits you see will be both the consultant team and us. The rest of them are just the Thurston County team. We're really taking the lead here
Okay.
in community planning because we want to develop relationships.
I
with all
just
the
see that the
groups.
dates don't match up.
Oh, do they not?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. The ones that you have in your agenda should be the accurate.
Okay, because that says May 13th, ours says May 11th, May 18th, May 15th.
Oh, sorry about that.
So I'm just wondering which one's right. This one's right.
That one should be right. I can
Okay.
take a look really quick and confirm which
I
is
know
the
Prairie
Saturday.
Appreciation Day is on May 11th.
Yes, okay. It was like I was like the 13th isn't a weekend. So yes, rely on the ones in there.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about the confusion. We'll update those dates at our end.
The summit dates are right. So the night of the 13th is a Thursday, and then the morning of the 15th is a Saturday.
So your team is going to be at these events?
Yep.
It'll be
Yes.
a combined effort.
Soliciting community, both sharing the approach, but mainly soliciting community input, at least for the summits. And the agendas for those 2 dates are the same, but we're hoping to get different people. So people that are coming in after work, and that works on a Thursday evening, versus people that go to events on Saturdays. So same agenda, same materials, just different dates and times.
Well, the Juneteenth is on June 15th versus June 19th, right?
Juneteenth is on June 19th.
No, but the meeting is on June 15th. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. The we'll send out a note to see how many planning commissioners may attend these to see if we have to do a special notice.
I thought you were gonna ask that tonight. I mean, I was prepared to
Oh,
tell you.
if you know already, I don't know what I'm doing. Well, actually, I do know what I'm doing.
calendar.
I'll be there, but otherwise, I'm not always certain. How about we just send out a follow-up email? We'll
Sounds
have
good.
Tasha do that. And then we'll grab commissioners that aren't here tonight. But it would be wonderful to have you attend.
And we understand that there was a lot to lot of information in an hour and a half time frame. And we really appreciate your input. And if you have any additional comments and inputs, please send those to Ashley or to staff, and then we will work through that. And really appreciate your advice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.
Appreciate the opportunity and all the input and feedback. Thank you all.
Yeah, we look forward to working with you guys. This will be staged.
Same here. Have a good night.
I'm so
Right.
glad we didn't just bring you draft chapters.
So are we. All right. Well, that brings us to item number 7. The general Thurston 2045 update. If you've got anything else for us.
And just to let you know that we're on track with the schedule that we've shared, so we will be returning, it's May 15th, right, for your chapter 9? So open space, recreation and environment, I totally messed that up.
Environment, recreation, and open space.
That's Amelia's chapter, she'll be back.
All right.
And we are also hoping to have that, water policy discussion with you that kind of spans multiple chapters, but ties in really closely with Amelia's chapters, but
Lots of time.
so, but yeah, we're trying to stick to that schedule. It's hard. But our team's doing a great job.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
so far.
the sustainable Thurston piece was the only other piece I wanted to make sure was on your radar.
All right. Staff updates. You
We are
again.
very close to filling our vacant senior planner role. It was all internal candidates. We have an amazing team. And so we'll be really excited to offer a promotion to somebody. So yeah, next meeting, I'll be able to share who that is.
Nice.
And that also means we'll have another opening, but
Oh, that's where it's got the position. Okay.
yeah, internal candidates means we'll have another opening, another opportunity to add
Opportunity.
an amazing team.
To strengthen the team.
And a team where you have opportunities for advancement.
Yes.
It's a good sign.
We like to celebrate that. And special thank you, Commissioner Day sat on the interview panel.
You're welcome.
How many votes did he get?
How many votes did he get? How was it weighted?
Votes is a big word. I need the rubric now.
He ran a tight interview. let
I
me
bet he
tell you.
did.
I was just along for the ride. Was a tight interview for sure. All right, moving on to calendar with agenda items. We've got 2 upcoming meeting dates. We have May 15th for number 14. And that was both the environment, recreation, open space, and overview of the water resources policies in the comprehensive plan. That was the bounce around, chase down the water policies. Do we have a sense of anybody who's not gonna be able to make it?
I'll be good.
15th. All right. And then we have a June 5th, June already. For number 15, work session with land use, chapter 2, natural resources, chapter 3. And we will be doing the LRA code public hearing.
And just a heads up, the land use chapter, I think we're gonna focus on the non-housing related elements of it to try to, you're gonna have a big meeting, and so limit the amount of time, and so many of the housing related pieces are gonna change. So we'll just hone in on the non-housing.
Let's break it up.
Do you have when you're setting your calendar and your work plan, have you just estimated how many more work sessions we'll be doing on LRA after the public hearing? Do you have us scheduled for any yet on your calendar, or are you expecting a recommendation in the same evening as?
We do not have any scheduled. However, if you all feel adamantly, we can make our incredibly tight planning commission glide path change. I don't again, I don't have the authority to pressure you into making that decision. So, you know, if you all don't feel comfortable issuing a recommendation after that hearing, I understand and, you know, Andrew's not here, but I'll make sure that I work with him to add that if you all so choose.
It'll depend on,
Yeah, I
citizens'
think
comments.
we might get a lot of people at our public hearing.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, we always will accommodate follow-up work sessions. We'll just have to make adjustments.
All right, and how does that date look for us? Do we look all right for the 5th? Okay. All right, moving on to good of the order. Commissioner Bartlett, I think you had one.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to point out that it is in fact, International Workers' Day. It is May 1st. All of the stuff that we're talking about on here, every building that needs to get put in, every plan that needs to get made, all of the time that you guys are spending on this. That is all stuff that is being done by working class folks, being done by workers that need to be respected in this. They are also the first people most vulnerable in climate change. They're the first people most vulnerable in the housing shifts, is people who have to not only do their work, but do their work and fight their bosses for better working conditions, fight their landlords to keep their housing. So I want to make sure that in everything that we do in here, those are the folks who are actually going to be building the Thurston County that we want are prioritized. That's just something I wanted to say, and I wanted to say just how much I appreciate the workers who are in this room. You guys have all been doing amazing work, and we appreciate you. And I'm sorry that I took a couple more minutes from your day to say that, but it needed to be said.
Thank you, Commissioner Bartlett. Commissioner Kaiser.
I just wanted to say thank you for the brownies. It was very thoughtful, especially for the long session we had tonight.
And thank my kids for getting up at 5:30.
Oh,
That's
Speaking of
wonderful.
workers. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
All right, anything else for the good of the order? All right, having no other business, this meeting is adjourned.
Yeah.
I had a schedule.